Hi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Rachel and I work at the Brookfield Library, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce tonight Matt Austin, who is the Director of Education, Training, and Outreach at the Women's Center of Greater Danbury. And he's going to talk to us tonight about sexual harassment. If you've been following along, this is the fourth presentation I think that we've had by the Women's Center of Greater Danbury. And we do have one more coming up in April on child sexual abuse that Matt will be presenting for us. And all of the presentations are recorded and left on our YouTube page, the Brookfield Library YouTube page, to be viewed at any time. So Matt, please go ahead, get us started.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm glad you're not sick of my face and the patrons aren't sick of my face. So here we are. So thank you again. So tonight, as Rachel said, I'm going to talk a little bit. Whoops, I should actually do a slideshow. I'm going to talk about sexual harassment, what it is, etc. I kind of, if you've been following along, I kind of touched on it in sexual assault, but we're going to go a little more in depth tonight about what it is, what it looks like, laws, etc. So yeah, let's get to it. So as Rachel said, I'm from the Women's Center of Greater Danbury. We are the local provider of services for victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. All of our services are free and confidential. We are called the Women's Center. We are for everyone. We are for anyone of any gender that needs our help. We are there to help them. What do our services entail? Counseling, support groups, education programs. We go into schools, we go into organizations, anybody who will listen to us, we will talk to. We do advocacy. We have a residential facility for victims and survivors in transition. They can come stay at our facility. Lots of different things that we offer to not just Danbury. It says Greater Danbury. We are 13 towns. So Brookfield, Danbury, we go from Richfield and Reading. Our reach is Richfield and Reading all the way up to Kent, Washington, Sherman area. So all the towns in between there in Western Connecticut we work with. So those are our phone numbers. That's a little bit about us. Like I've said the other weeks, some of the stuff we might be talking about is sensitive. If you're uncomfortable at any time, feel free to just close out the program. Like Rachel said, it will be here archived on the Brookfield YouTube page if you would like to come back to it. Again, watch it in chunks, whatever it may be. Feel free to step away if you thought about, I'm going to watch it live, and then some of it is uncomfortable, etc. And also note, in talking about the material we talk about, if something is triggering, the Women's Center is here. So you can call us, these hotlines that we talked about. We're here 24 hours a day helping folks. So if you want to talk about something, we are here to help you. Feel free. So today we're going to understand the dynamics of harassment and its impact. Explore different types of harassment, review really kind of what the definition is, and discuss what to do if that is happening to you, how you can help others, and the resources that are out there for you. So we got a lot to get through. So why are we talking about sexual harassment? Yes, the Brookfield Library booked me to talk about it, but in the larger sense of why are we talking about harassment, it's with the Me Too movement, all this stuff coming up, a lot of people have said, well, sexual harassment is becoming more and more, it's becoming a bigger problem more and more. Unfortunately, as we look at statistics and things, the problem has always been there. It has been, it's more acceptable to talk about, and people are more coming out to talk about it. And that's really why we're here, is to encourage that talking about it. We always say at the Women's Center, an educated community is a safer community. And that's very simply why programs like this exist. So just some things. A study found that more than half of women surveyed reported experiencing unwanted and inappropriate sexual advances at some point in their lifetime. It's important to note also, harassment can happen to anyone, by anyone. We'll talk about that. So it's not just women. I think we have that stereotype of a man harassing a woman. Yes, that does happen. But any gender can harass any gender, and it can be sexual harassment, any gender to any gender. We're going to dive deep into, for those who experience sexual harassment, 3 out of the 4 victims don't tell anyone or formally report. So again, why now? We want to normalize talking about these sorts of topics, all the topics that the Brookfield Library has had me come in for. We want to normalize it so that people feel more comfortable coming forward, talking about it, etc. So that's why we are here today. So this slide is a lot of legal mumbo jumbo from Connecticut on what the wording of what sexual harassment is. It boils down to this. I boiled it down to an easier readable definition. Sexual harassment is any unwanted or unwelcome verbal, visual, or physical conduct of a severe nature that is sexual nature that is pervasive or severe. So what I like to, when I go into schools, I say it has to check 3 boxes: sexual or sexist in nature, unwanted or unwelcome, pervasive or severe. So let's break those down just a little bit. So sexual or sexist in nature. So sexual meaning something having to do with sex or sexual orientation or the way someone looks, that falls under the sexual category. That's the sexual harassment that we tend to see. We've all seen those terrible 80s training videos on sexual harassment, that sort of thing. That is the more obvious things that fall under sexual harassment. But it's interesting to note too that sexist in nature falls under sexual harassment too. Any negative behavior towards someone because of gender is also considered sexual harassment under Connecticut state law. So it's important to know sexual, the more obvious things that we'll delve into: sexist, having to do with gender, negative contact regarding gender. Unwanted, unwelcome, we'll dive a little bit more into this, but it's unwanted, unwelcome by the receiver. The person who is receiving the words or the actions does not want the attention or the words or whatever it might be. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And pervasive or severe. So it is a pattern. You see it on a regular basis from that person. That person every day is making those comments or giving catcalling or whatever it may be. It's a pattern, that pervasive or severe. We're going to get more into that. I'm getting ahead of myself in my brain and the words aren't getting out of my mouth. So sexual harassment really falls under 2 separate categories. You can kind of categorize all sexual harassment in 2 categories: quid pro quo or hostile environment. This is especially true in employment and workplaces. They fall under quid pro quo and hostile environment. So that's the categories: quid pro quo, Latin for this, for that. So it's an exchange, suggesting sexual favors or making comments or coercing someone in exchange for something. That person feels like they have to do something, or they won't get that promotion, or they won't get that better grade, or it's for better treatment. So quid pro quo and hostile environment is really anything that creates an environment where people feel uncomfortable or unsafe and are prevented from participating or benefiting from a program or activity. So it affects their work, it affects their education, it creates a hostile environment where that person feels unsafe. We'll talk more about that. So the eye of the beholder goes back to this unwanted, unwelcome thing. So regardless of the intention of the harasser, it is the recipient's interpretation of the action or behavior that determines whether it's sexual harassment. So basically, it's how the person that is receiving the actions or words or whatever it may be, how they feel about it. It doesn't matter how the person, quote unquote, meant it. You hear a lot of times in sexual harassment situations, well, oh, it was just a joke. I was just joking, or whatever it may be. And it doesn't matter how that person, quote unquote, meant it. If you feel uncomfortable, if you're being made uncomfortable by it, sexual harassment is that eye of the beholder. And again, this is where with sexual harassment, it is really important to have sort of that boundary. We talked about healthy relationships way back months ago, boundaries and communicating those boundaries, because in some cases, when that person is making those maybe uncomfortable comments, they do not realize what they're saying is not okay, because no one has ever told them it's not okay. So that is an important piece of this too, is communicating those boundaries. We'll talk about how you can help situations if you see them happening in your workplace, or if you're a student and you see them in your school, what you can do. But it's important to speak up and talk about that. So where's the line? So I'm going to talk about different examples and where that line is. Sometimes I talk about sexual harassment, and again, I've gone into companies and they're like, well, I can't like hug a coworker. I can't even say hello to a coworker. That's sexual harassment. That's not sexual harassment. It doesn't check those three boxes: the sexual or sexist, unwanted, unwelcome, pervasive, or severe. So when we take a look at, let's take a look at some not sexual harassment side of this. Complimenting someone's outfit. Again, saying, hey, Julie, that's a nice sweater. Not sexual harassment, but it could cross the line if making uncomfortable comments about that person's body or clothing. And maybe every day that person is saying, oh, that sweater looks real nice on you. And it's, again, the eye of the beholder, how that person feels about it, or whistling or cat calling. So that's when it becomes that sexual harassment. Not sexual harassment, holding the door open for someone. Not sexual harassment. That's just nice courtesy. But again, if you're making those comments or you touch that person inappropriately. Now, when we talk about touching that person inappropriately, in the state of Connecticut, and I talked about this in sexual assault a little bit, if a person is touched on the breast, buttocks, genitals, or inner thigh, and it's unwanted by that person, it is baseline sexual harassment. So it can very simply be reported for sexual harassment, but it could also toe the line into sexual assault. So back here, when I was talking about physical contact, that's what I was talking about, is baseline, that's sexual harassment, could turn to sexual assault depending on the situation. Again, not sexual harassment smiling at someone, but leering at someone. If you take a look at this whole category, I'm not going to go through all of them, but if you take a look at this whole category, this sexual harassment category all falls under this hostile environment. Creates that hostile environment for that person. That person does not feel safe being around the person that is doing these actions or saying these words. And again, this can happen, sexual harassment can happen anywhere. I think that's another myth of like, well, it just happens in the workplace, or like, we spend a lot of time in the workplace, so that's why we hear about that a lot. But it really can happen in public, the grocery store. It can happen in many different places. So again, this pyramid that I think I showed this pyramid in sexual assault as well. But this sexual harassment is and sexual assault is a sort of a snowball. Smaller things lead to bigger things, which lead to bigger things. So we want to stop it before it becomes something even worse. So down here on the bottom rows, homophobic, transphobic, sexist, problematic language, objectification, sexual harassment. That's that sort of bottom row there. If we start to normalize that, brush that off, don't recognize that that's not okay or call that out, then that person who is saying those things or doing those things may feel that those things are okay. So then they'll bump up a ring to traditional gender roles, rigid gender-based stereotypes, negative comments based on gender. That also falls under the sexist part of that. Again, if someone thinks those are okay and isn't called out, then they may think that harassment, threats, verbal abuse is okay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why programs like this, or just really having these conversations in workplaces, Connecticut just passed a law very recently that sexual harassment trainings have to be implemented for all new employees. They have to have 2 hours of sexual harassment training for all new employees, and the companies, workplaces need to provide sexual harassment training at least once every 10 years for the other employees. So it's a start, again, not to normalize these behaviors and make them okay, or make someone feel that they are okay. Harassment in the workplace, this is that law that I was talking about. I kind of went into it. Harassment education. So I haven't talked a lot about sexual harassment in education. There's a law in Connecticut, Title IX. You probably have heard that phrase, especially when it comes to sports. There's been a lot of talk of Title IX recently, and gender discrimination. So Title IX is very simply a law that prohibits sex discrimination in educational settings, sex, gender. So any sexual harassment, any gender harassment, or prohibiting someone to do something based on sex or gender against the law under Title IX in an educational setting. So again, they are protected. I always say to schools, because some students say to me, well, sexual harassment's against the law, so what's the difference? I always like to put it, well, sexual harassment's against the law, but Title IX is an extra level of sort of protection for folks in public education. Private institutions don't have to follow Title IX, but most private institutions either follow Title IX on their own accord or have similar policies to Title IX internally. So again, it all boils down to sexual harassment, all boils down to healthy relationships. We want to have healthy relationships with our friends, with our coworkers, with acquaintances, people in our lives. So sexual harassment is all about understanding and communicating boundaries, communicating your boundaries, communication, having empathy for and understanding someone else's boundaries, respecting those boundaries, very simply respecting those person's boundaries. Because again, you may think something is a joke or be like, but that person may not think it's a joke. So it's all about respect of boundaries and be welcome and opening. When it comes to victims and survivors of sexual harassment, how might they feel? There is no right or wrong answer to this. These are some common things we see in folks we work with that have been in sexual harassment situations. There is a change in behavior. There is a trouble concentrating. There is the trouble concentrating. Depression can lead to a depression, anxiety, embarrassment or shame. Embarrassment or shame is a big one that we see a lot. And it's important for me to reiterate that sexual harassment is not the victim's fault. It is never your fault if this stuff is happening to you. No one chooses for this to happen to them. But a lot of times, if this is happening on a regular basis, there is that embarrassment or shame of like, oh, I must have done something. I must have led this person on, or what we see a lot in high schools, unfortunately, is, well, I dressed a certain way. So, or on the other side of that, harassers saying, well, if you didn't want me to say these things, why did you dress like that? Very simply victim blaming. That's what that is. Again, never the victim's fault. But in a lot of cases, they may feel that they have done something. They have not. How might somebody feel? Fear. There might be fear. Like I said, it creates a hostile environment. Fear of that person. That is that statistic we saw way back at the beginning of the 3 out of 4 don't tell anyone, because of that fear of retaliation from that person, fear of not being believed, that this person is doing these things or saying these things to that person, the victim or the survivor. So there is that fear. The biggest fear is that retaliation. Something is going to happen. When it comes to workplaces, a lot of companies now have zero tolerance policies on sexual harassment, which when you hear that, you go, that's great. That's great. It is and it isn't. The zero tolerance policies sometimes make an environment that person feels uncomfortable reporting, because they don't want this person fired. They just want the actions to stop. So if there's a zero tolerance policy, that person won't report the action because they don't want them fired. They just want this to stop. And then they may not say anything to anyone, and the harassment just continues and continues and continues. So again, it's important if you you have a workplace, you are an employer, to really have an environment that is safe and people feel safe in reporting. Anonymous reports are always a great way. If you want to have that, etc. It depends on what your policies are, but stress, again, trouble eating, trouble sleeping, paranoia, all of these things, a lot of these things, depression, trouble concentrating, are mental, and they can lead a lot of times to physical. So when we talk about, I think I talked about it in sexual assault a little bit, but sexual harassment is a power and control situation. All of these things I've talked about, this one person is trying to have some sort of power, some sort of control over the other person. So in a lot of these sexual harassment situations, what happens is that power is being taken away through this harassment. So the person, the victim, the survivor, tries to take some sort of control in their life. So maybe that control looks like not going to work or not eating, or and they start to have health problems and the stress and anxiety. So basically what I'm saying is a lot of these things can lead to physical health problems. They start off as mental problems and could turn to physical health problems instead of mental health problems. But they usually start as mental health problems if on the victim and or survivor. So I kind of talked about this. Why don't victims report? Repercussion professionally and personally. If it is a personal situation, it might be a friend group or someone you are very close to, and you don't want to make it weird in that friend group, or you don't want to it may be a husband or a wife's friend, and you don't want to get into an argument with your wife or husband or whatever it may be. Like I said, embarrassment, shame, guilt, the person feeling like it's their fault. Don't think they will be believed. That's a huge piece of it. They don't think that anyone's going to believe them or listen, especially in a lot of these cases. This person usually, these are in workplaces more often than not. These are very well-liked people, higher powered people, as we're seeing coming out in the Me Too movement. Higher powered people, they don't feel like their voice is going to be heard, and that's why it's so important to encourage folks to speak out, and if you are a victim, to speak out, and if someone does speak out and comes to you to talk about it, believing them is a huge piece of this. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as I always do in these presentations. Don't think anything will get done or they will receive justice. It's staggering, the statistics of, even if somebody reports something to a police, the police or workplace or et cetera, the statistics, the amount of people that actually see justice, whether justice looks different for everyone, is very small, unfortunately. The folks that whatever they're looking for justice, whether it's jail time or whatever it may be. The amount of times that actually happens is very, very small. Complaint because of their identity in the community. Again, those high-powered people, whether it's Harvey Weinstein or Bill Cosby or those folks, all those different, they hold that power, and they could very much like that completely ruin someone's career. Again, not okay. Don't want to get the abuser in to get that person in trouble. Like I said, in the workplace, sometimes they don't want that person fired. They just want that person to stop. Maybe that person may be someone's partner. Very simply, they don't want to break up with that person. They just want the behavior to stop. And made to feel bad about repercussions for abuser. Again, that's all connected. The most common response of those who were victimized by sex-based harassment was avoid the person, deny or downplay the gravity of the situation, attempt to ignore, forget, or endure the behavior. So this is usually what happens in these situations. They try to avoid. This is that change in behavior. A lot of times, let's say, for instance, you are working with that person and it's a cubicle situation, and you usually have to walk to the lunchroom past that person's desk. You may completely change your route so you don't have to see that person. Or when I talk about school, same thing, routes to class. It's changing. That person feels like they have to change their behavior when in fact it is the harasser that needs to change their behavior. So let's talk about it. You deserve right to feel safe wherever you are, especially at work or at school, anywhere you are. What to do if you are being harassed? Very simply, if you feel comfortable, the first thing you can do is very simply tell them if it is safe to do so. And I know a lot of situations it may not be safe to do so, but that's sometimes a huge step. As I said in the beginning, they may not know what they're saying or doing is wrong, or and maybe no one's ever said it to them, and maybe you can be that person to say it to them. But again, a lot of these situations, there's so many things in play that you're like, I don't want to directly address it. So there's lots of different things. If you're at work, you can report it to a supervisor. There are sexual harassment laws for workplaces. Very simply, if it is outside of a work situation, you can go to the police. If you don't necessarily want to make a police report or make a report at work, you just want to like talk to somebody, that's what we are here for. You can call us, you can call the Women's Center, talk about it, and really make sort of a safety plan of how you can stay safe and feel good and continue to do your work or go to school or whatever it may be, and make it a safe environment for you. A big thing we say when it comes to be sexual harassment or any kind of harassment, really, be sure to document those incidents as best as you can, especially if you plan on going to the police. This will establish an evidence of a pattern. So like I said, way back at the beginning, it has to be a pattern or severe. A lot of times in these sexual harassment situations, it becomes a they said. It's very gender non-specific. It's a very they said situation of there isn't documented evidence, but very simply writing it down of like, Tuesday at 10 a.m. so-and-so said this to me. That's a nice record of those things to have if you decide to go to HR at your workplace or go to the police. They're going to want to see that documentation of that sort of thing so they can then go forward with that. So very simply, if someone is sexually harassing you, again, it is not your fault. No one chooses for this sort of thing to happen to them. What happens if you, how you can help? How can you as a citizen of Connecticut, help this situation, get rid of this sexual harassment altogether? Very simply, take sexual harassment seriously. No joking about it, no minimizing it. Again, that sort of normalizes those behaviors. We see it a lot in television. Again, there's the jokes on TV or saying, it's not a big deal. It's locker room talk, or boys will be boys, or whatever it may be. This is a serious matter. And it's important to take it seriously before it becomes something worse, even worse than that. Have conversations with family and friends about these issues. Again, as I said at the beginning, talking about it is a huge first step to eradicating it, is bringing it up. And because of Me Too and a lot of things, people are feeling more comfortable speaking up about all of this, and it's becoming more of a national conversation, which is good. People are becoming aware. Be empathetic and remember that everyone has different boundaries and comfort levels. Again, remembering that your boundaries are very different from someone else's. You cannot look at someone and know what their boundaries are, very simply. So you don't know if what you're saying to that person is okay or not okay. So be empathetic and remember that everyone has different boundaries. If you see it in the workplace, at the grocery store, there's a lot of different things you can do. Distract and separate, get that person out of the situation. The good example of that is a few years ago, I was at a bar with a friend, and we were sitting at the bar just chatting, and we saw down at the end of the bar that there was a girl sort of against a wall, and a guy had her cornered, of kind of his hand was on the bar. It's hard to explain, but anyway, she couldn't really move out of the seat that she was in, and it was very obvious that she didn't know this person, this gentleman, and she was very uncomfortable. So when we were sitting there, and we were like, what can we do? And distract and separate is always a good use, a good tactic. There we go. So my friend happened to be female. She went over and kind of started to talk to the gentleman to get his attention away from that woman. I went over to the woman, chatted with the woman, and sort of got her out of there and got her a taxi. We were in the city, out of there. And she was, I'm not telling you that story to be like, I'm amazing, but that's an example of that distract and separate. Diffuse the situation, get those people away from each other if you can. That's a tactic. Be a support system to the victim. Sometimes we can't, again, directly address the situation in that moment, but if you see something happening, you can go up to the victim or survivor afterwards and say, hey, I saw what so-and-so said to you. Is everything okay? Are you okay? Do you want to talk? Being that support system is probably one of the best things you can do. One of the first steps, best things you can do is be there for that person. See if that person is okay. Challenging the behavior. Again, if it's safe to do so, go up into that situation and say, hey, call it out. Say, hey, this isn't cool. Don't say that. Or those sorts of things. Again, if it's safe to do so. Get an authority, again, somebody in a workplace or police, or if it's a school situation, a teacher or a principal. Appeal to their best self, make it personal. These are some tactics that we sometimes use. Make it personal. How would you like if somebody was making those comments to you? Or you seem like a really good guy, but you're a girl, but you're saying some really inappropriate things. That's appealing to their best self, making them feel like, well, oh, my comments are not coming off great. That sort of thing. So a lot of different tactics, bystander intervention tactics, but again, addressing the situation directly. And if you feel uncomfortable doing that, helping the victim afterwards, being there for that person, being a support system for that person. Good. That is pretty much all I have for you tonight. Again, we are here at the Women's Center 24 hours a day. If you want to talk about this, if you want to call me, my 5200, 203-731-5200 is our number here. My extension is 226. You can call me. Or we have 24/7 hotlines where you can talk to a counselor if you need that. So just know that we are here for you. All right. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah.
Another informative and interesting presentation, and I really appreciate
Yeah.
you doing this for us. And it's very timely, of course, with Me Too and with the training in Connecticut. So I'm really glad we're able to cover this. And as I mentioned before, the next one will be on child sexual abuse and warning signs, identification, and things like that. And that will be on April 14th.
And that one, I just want to throw out there, that sounds like a really heavy one that if I heard the title, I would be like, I don't want to come to that. But it's a good training and to recognize red flags and things like that. And I always suggest it for grandparents, parents, anyone who has children in their life. It is a hard topic to talk about, but it's an important one. Sorry, I didn't mean to take your thunder.
No, you didn't. No, I couldn't agree more. It's not like a fun topic, but it's an important topic.
It's not like basket weaving or something like that the library offers or whatever.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, well, thank you again, and we'll see you in April.
Bye. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Cool. All right.
Oh, we may still be streaming. Hold on. I always do this. Okay, now we're done.
All right. I won't say anything.